welcome everybody to our fashion talk, a series of talks that Central St Martin's is hosting with various brilliant people. Today's brilliant person is Daniel, who you just overheard talking with the equally brilliant David Capo about the provenance of African textiles, which we will definitely get into. Daniel, hello, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And also welcome to members of FACE Group. We have opened this talk up to them as well, so we're really happy to have you all here. Daniel's going to share his screen, and as usual, I'm going to ask him some questions about his work. And of course, if you have any questions that come into your head during that session, then please do pop them in the chat, and I'll go through those before the session finishes. But Daniel, if you wanted to share your screen and give us a bit of an introduction into your work.
Yeah. So I guess I'm a menswear designer by trade, although I'm trying to branch into women's wear now. But I mostly focus on working with textile designers, artisans, wherever I can find them. I work with Nigerian artisans, I guess, every season. There's I guess, like a new spin on an old technique type thing. But yeah, I generally don't, I guess, it's not just the Nigerian artisans. I also work with a guy in Donegal, Ireland, who is one of a handful of people that still hand weaves Donegal tweed in the traditional way, and he's been doing it for years. And he works for a lot of the kind of big factories out there in Donegal. I also started, as well as some inside South China, I work with, it's a village where they spin and weave silk and mud dye it, like traditional techniques. I haven't had the chance to get out there yet, just because of the pandemic. But yeah, so that's been a really interesting development, as it's mostly been done over Zoom via intermediary. Yeah, so this is one of my earlier works. This collection, I guess, is made solely from textiles from Nigeria, all dyed naturally using indigo.
Someone's singing along.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. Like
when did you do this piece?
So this was six or 5 years ago. Like, I'm really bad with time. But yeah, about 6 or 5 years ago. I was, I guess, going back to Nigeria. So I was born in Nigeria, but I hadn't been back for something like 20 years. So it was like the first time I went back, and I wanted to kind of look more at a kind of traditional fabric that was based there. It was actually, I guess, I did the denim project at CSM. And I remember the tutor we had at the time, William Green. He's the one that actually told me that, you know, there was indigo in Nigeria, which like was mind blowing for me. And just going back to that conversation we had with David at the beginning, like back then, I as well assumed that the Dutch wax print was African textile. So I was really blown away when I went back and I found dye pits in the north of the country, and it's been around for over 500 years. So yeah, I was really blown away by it, and it's, in a way, it's kind of sad, because at the time I didn't feel like there was anyone really trying to push this bit of like heritage in Nigeria, well, outside of the country anyway. There's actually a lot of rich history that ties into this hand-woven textiles and the indigo dye pits, because it also ties back to the old trade routes. that kind of connected North Africa to Europe and the rest of Africa in general. You know, people used to travel traditionally. The technique was used for the headwear. So, like you see a lot of I guess guys from Mali and Niger, and they would travel. They'd literally travel across territories to get the cloth from Kano in Nigeria. So yeah, this was something that when I went back, it really blew me away. And they have all these like this home-built looms that they've been using since the beginning of time. It's like a little bubble in time that it still exists out there.
Because you mentioned to me that before when we've spoken is that, you know, you had an awareness, a kind of implicit awareness of African textiles and crafts. But it wasn't really until you had this experience here at St. Martin's when you were studying that you began to look at it and think about, you know, I guess some of the techniques that we're so used to seeing owned, if you like, from other parts of the world, right? Because when we think of indigo dyeing, people don't think of Nigeria, really. That's not the first place you come to. And even techniques like borrow, which obviously is Japanese, but there are elements of all of this throughout the world that we haven't really paid that much attention to, which is something that you very much with Monad and with your work, you're sort of rewriting that. But I wondered, can you talk us a bit more about your feelings at realizing that this stuff existed? Because I'm interested in this kind of almost embarrassment that you almost carry. It's almost a bit like, oh, how did I not know this? And I wondered, we obviously firstly need to kind of get over that, right? Because we can't know everything. But I wondered why you think you didn't know that. It's a difficult question to answer, but I wondered, how do you address something like that?
Yeah, I mean, again, like when I look back on it, I feel like, I guess no one in Nigeria, like even when I was growing up, was kind of trying to drill that into me in a sense. Like, because, you know, I'm obsessed with Japanese culture, and, you know, like, even when the indigo dyeing, it's like, it's almost sacred. There's schools where you go to learn how to dye indigo from masters. And it's something that they've, you know, like shown to the world. So, and from my understanding, indigo dyeing has existed in Nigeria a lot longer than it has in Japan. So it's, like, I guess that's where a lot of the embarrassment comes from, because I was born in Nigeria. I lived there up until I was 11, and, you know, it took Will to tell me that there's indigo in Nigeria, you know, and even Adire, that's indigo, and I still didn't make the connection over all this time. So yeah, I don't know how we'd address. I guess maybe more people like me talking about it would be a start. You know, at the time, I was trying to see if there was any way of getting the Nigerian government to kind of pay attention to this, like, heritage we have, but that's like another nightmare in itself, and I just won't touch that. I guess the best way to address it is, I guess, just talking about it and highlighting that these things do exist.
Is this from the same period, this collection?
Yeah, so this is actually made from, like, I don't know if you look closer, it's kind of all hand tacked together. So it's a smaller loom that they use, and you sometimes see the young kids, and it's kind of training them how to use the bigger loom. So it's about 5 inches, and these kind of weave. And then to put it together in a blanket, it's all done by hand. So really, I saw a blanket similar in a market, like in Kano, and that I just thought of, you know, putting that into a shirt, because I am very much obsessed with, you know, hand finishing techniques and things being made by hand. But yeah, it was really interesting to me. But again, like, even there, I don't think they perceive the value of the craft or the work for what it is. it's just really interesting to me seeing that, and I guess me borrowing from it to kind of express that this is an amazing technique that does exist.
Yeah.
And it has other uses than, you know, what they actually use it for. I actually took the lookbook back there after I'd made it, and they were really shocked at what I'd done with the fabrics I bought from it. Because again, like in the traditional terms, it's like the bigger, kind of looser shape and traditional clothing it would have been used for, or wrapper for the women. So it was really, I guess it was really interesting for them to see it in the more kind of Western silhouettes.
Yeah. Because that was one of my questions actually, is the reaction that you've received, because in a sense you're appropriating your own culture, right? You're kind of going back and looking at things with a British eye, because you kind of grew up here. And so there is this kind of interesting, and you're part of a generation of designers that I've noticed that are doing this, you know, that are second generation or first or third generation, and are now looking at other countries, or the countries that their parents were born in, or their grandparents, and are going back there. But I'm always really interested in that tension of what you take out of it. You know, you're kind of recontextualizing it, of course, you're taking something, but along with that, there are some kind of pretty difficult situations I'm imagining that may happen. You know, if you're taking something that, for example, is sacred, or something that you may not necessarily, I guess this is why it's so important to understand a culture that you are using for inspiration, for all of you that are designers, or even not even designers, is to know what something means before you add another meaning onto it. And I like kind of how you are kind of actively engaged in the creation of these things with people that have been doing them for centuries. And I wondered have you ever had any negative reaction from anyone, perhaps, who may not necessarily understand why you're doing this, why your shapes are kind of more tailored, or why it feels more European, perhaps, in the way that it's cut?
No, not yet. No, not yet. But again, with that question, I guess, like most designers, you generally, you know, you're inspired by things around you, and like you said, you know, I guess at the time I never really looked at it as such, but naturally, of course, I'm inspired by my two upbringings, which is, you know, the Nigerian and this British side. So a lot of the things I was doing early on without realizing was kind of merging the two. But, you know, up until this collection, this was, I guess, the realization that, you know, a lot of things that inspired me is kind of looking at the two things and trying to mesh it together, because I never really understood why. I guess there was always some kind of conflict between like the shapes and the silhouette, and I guess it just bleeds into everything I do without me realizing at the time. But now I kind of have a better sense of it. So I guess, yeah, in a way, it was kind of like pushing me and saying, hey, this is
yeah.
But yeah, I guess
and there's a huge focus on tailoring in what you do. Would you say that that's right? And where does that kind of interest come from? Because there's a real smartness, a kind of sartorial, sharpness to the clothes that you make that contrasts with some of the hand-spun textiles. And I wondered where you think that comes from.
So again, sorry, the tailoring, I think, definitely comes from, you know, my Western influences, and I guess kind of more British tailoring in particular, because there's a lot of handwork that goes into it. I don't know if anyone's ever come across like Savile tailored jacket. It's actually insane the amount of work that goes into one of those pieces. And I guess growing up, like a suit was like what you had to have as a man, you know, to be taken serious. I remember my first ever interview. I think it was called All Sports, which is like a sports retail my granddad made me wear a suit to the interview, which like I look back now and it's to me it's insane because it's a sports shop. So
did you get the job?
I mean, I got the job, but I didn't.
It was the suit. It was the suit.
Yeah,
it was. Granddad was right.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of where that influence of the tailoring comes from. But then with that, there's a lot of things I don't like about a kind of classic tailored suit. You know, for me, it's really stiff and uptight. And so this is where I think my kind of more African influences comes from. Because one thing about Nigerians or Africans in general is just there's a very kind of do it yourself kind of thing. It's like, you know, you'll see something and then you just kind of replicate it in the best way you know how. So I guess very early on, a lot of the things I would do is, you know, these kind of really sharp shapes, but then using these textiles that you wouldn't normally associate with the shapes. But at that time, it was what I had access to. So I just tried to make it work to the best of my abilities. But like now it's still a thing. I like using fabrics that you wouldn't associate with a shape. And I think it breaks down, it makes the whole kind of tailoring suit aspect more approachable in my eyes. So yeah, I think like a lot of my shapes are kind of influenced by the two, without it being, well, I try not to heavily over borrow from one or the other. Try and find the kind of perfect balance.
Do you think, you said at the beginning that you introduced yourself as a menswear designer, but obviously that is likely to change as our understanding of what a man wears and what a woman wears and all other genders being represented. So I wondered how important, because the tailored suits do feel like the classic kind of menswear example. You talk about Savile Row, but do you think the suit as it is still has this kind of social importance? Do you think you'd still be advised by you know, somebody to wear a suit to an interview? Because it's still, I can understand where that's coming from, but I wondered if you still think that happens today.
I think it depends on the type of interview, like, of course. I think just dressing smart for an interview generally, I feel is the way these days. But I imagine if you went to the city for an interview at a bank, you'd have to wear a suit. You know, and, you know, I never really understood this, but bankers actually are very knowledgeable when it comes to bespoke suits. They I guess every Savile Row house has their own kind of niches and you go to them for a reason. But yeah, they can sniff like a made to measure versus a bespoke pretty quickly, which is quite surprising. But then again, I guess it goes back more into the whole kind of world of banking as a whole, and you know, you have to be perceived in a certain way. But yeah, I think it varies, depends on the interview. I certainly wouldn't wear a suit to an interview for a design job, for instance, because in that, I guess you'd want to portray yourself, like, you know, I guess in a sense have your creativity on show. So maybe a suit kind of, I would like, I mean, personally, I think a suit just kind of mutes that entirely and you just become like a regular, every other guy type.
Not in one of yours though, come on.
Oh no, of course not. I mean,
I was wondering, do you have many bespoke clients then? Do you have bankers that are wearing Monad in the city?
No. Because again, so like one of the things that I dislike from a tailored suit was the shoulder pads. So I take those out, and my shoulder shape kind of goes more with your natural shoulder silhouette. For a banker, that's a big no-no. they could wear it on as a casual jacket, but I think, yeah, raw edges and all that jazz wouldn't sit very well in the banking world.
Could you show us the next picture? So you talk about kind of raw edges and a certain softness. There's a sort of, I guess, informality to a lot of the shapes. And also you're working with a lot of textiles that I imagine over time will start to change as well. You know, things like hand spun linens and indigo dyes, those things won't, you know, if you have a jacket like made out of something like that, it won't look the same for 5 years. It will keep developing to you, right?
Yeah, of course. And I guess consciously as kind of the idea, especially when you're like working with garments that are dyed. You know, I wear my clothes to death, and I kind of feel like that's, I don't know, speaking in this new sustainable world, it's kind of the way to go. I mean, growing up, I mean, I'd have to save loads of money to buy anything I wanted. And in fact, I kind of got into fashion because I couldn't afford it to buy anything I really wanted. So I'd end up having to make it or customizing bits of garments that I found. So whenever I bought something that was expensive, you know, I treated it like gold dust, and was really precious with it. But at the same time, I guess, I don't know, clothes are made to be worn, so you shouldn't really treat it like that. So I guess with my pieces, a lot of the fraying and the raw edges is just to give you that idea that even though it's, you know, made by hand and there's like all this work that's gone into it, I want it to be worn, and, you know, over time it becomes your own. In the same way, like when vintage denim was a thing, you know, you always put your phone in the same pocket so that when you put it through that first wash, you've got all these like different abrasions and scratches that it's like personal to you. So yeah, I think it is something that like I think of, because there are pieces that I've had over time now that are completely a different color, especially the indigo stuff, for instance. You know, I didn't think about it so much when I was doing it initially, but it's just happened that way. And, you know,
you've ruined a lot of sofas, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'm just thinking of, you know, back, you know, years ago, and it still sort of happens today, but, you know, you spend a lot of money on denim, for example. This is like, you know, when I was a student here 20 years ago, and it would have a warning label in it that would say, don't sit on this for too long, or the dye will come off. And that still happens to lots of things that you buy today. And I could never really compute why something that had cost me so much money, arguably that value changes to whoever's talking about it. But you just think, well, why can't I use it properly? It's also with the Isemyaki Pleats Please collection. You know, I don't know whether you've ever looked, but the label inside all of the Pleats Please has this hilarious kind of statement that essentially says, don't sit down for too long, which I just think is mad, because you just think, well, why? Hang on a minute, I bought this thing and you're telling me I can't sit down, because the pleats will obviously over time iron themselves out. So I'm really fascinated in the relationship, because your clothes are so tactile. Even though we're looking at a picture here, you can feel it in your fingers. And I wondered how the last year of communicating in this way has maybe affected your relationship to the textiles, and the sorts of things that you want to go on to make.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing for me is not being able to like visit any of the warehouses or dealers that I've worked with in the past. Like, for instance, there's a couple I work with, they actually sell in Spitalfields Market, but I buy a lot of antique textiles from them. And the only way they could get a hold of those textiles to begin with is traveling. And obviously COVID, to begin with, kind of stopped a lot of that. They've been self-isolating like all this time. So I've only been able to buy from them kind of backlogs they've had, so nothing new in that sense. Also, like, I like to raid warehouses as well. I find it very hard to kind of look at an image of a fabric and be like, okay, I can make this with it. I kind of have to see it and feel it to kind of I guess in my mind, create possibilities for it. So that's kind of been the biggest struggle for me personally, not being able to travel and see textiles. So I have been working a lot with, I guess over the years as well, I've managed to hoard a lot of dead stock fabric, because I'll turn up and it's a case of, oh, I've got 5 meters of this, and then I'm like, I'll take it, hopefully maybe I'll sell it, and then it just ends up sitting in this little stockpile. So I guess in a good way, I've been having to eat into the little collection I've kind of built up over the years, but then it's been tricky for buyers, because then they're like, oh, can we get 4 of these? And I'm like, oh, well, I can only make 2 garments out of it.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? Because I think because we talk so much about producing in this more ethical and sustainable way, as you say, using a new language that didn't really exist when you were studying in particular. And that's been celebrated, and we all know that that's a good thing, and we all say it's a good thing, and the students in this room, the designers, have been told it to death. But practically, how is that working? Because unless the buyers and the stores, so the buyers you're talking about, obviously the buyers of stores and department stores, unless they sort of also come on board and understand what it is that they're buying, it just makes things more difficult. Because in theory, it should be great. They should say, great, just make 2 then. But that kind of level of understanding, is that there yet? Are we there?
Yeah, like I think my buyers are there, but again, like I only have 1 store outside of Japan. Essentially, so and that's Hostem in London. And again, I guess I've been lucky in a sense, but also in my past with dealing with department stores, I kind of very early on I let them know, how it works essentially. And as a general rule, especially with hand woven textiles, just because everybody wants things now, like no one really wants to wait. But if someone's hand weaving fabric, it's going to take them a long time to be able to do. If the store wanted like 10 pieces of a jacket, for instance, it's not going to happen. So like I have a limit of 4 pieces as a maximum for any one style in a fabrication. And I guess that's mostly down to when I work with hand weavers. For them, it's better to do like a 10-meter weave than just only weave for 1 piece of garment. Just because it takes them quite a while to set up the loom to begin with, and then obviously it's like a lot of man hours just weaving the fabric to begin with. So like 4 is kind of a good number for them and for me, because it'll take me forever to hand finish like 10 garments is the same. So as a general rule, there's like a limit on how much they can buy, so they're all pretty much aware of that. And so I think from my experience, I think department store buyers struggle with it. Of course, they want to, if it's a good thing, they want more of it to sell more of. But then also, I think there's a problem with the system in terms that, they're buying with knowing in mind that, there's like a short space of shelf life for the pieces, and it's going to have to go into sale at some point. So, they have to recover, like make money at a certain point. So I guess if you're buying 2 pieces, you're not going to make as much money as if you bought 10 of the same garment, essentially. But with my pieces, they don't go into sale, just because it devalues the product and the hours that have been put into making it in the first place. And I think this is something for the Japanese market, and they're very much into that. Also, I wasn't aware how many different fashion stores there were in places like Tokyo, for instance. So for the buyers, it's really good that, they'll buy a product that they're not likely to see in their competitor, which is like 2 minutes down the road. Just because a lot of stores end up having a lot of the same brands. for garments.
And is it easier to work in this way than when you first when you graduated in 2012, I think it was?
Yeah.
And when did you launch Monad?
2016, yeah.
Okay, so since 2016, is it easier to do what you're doing? How have you refined what you started out setting out to do and where you are at right now? Because it feels like the conversation on so many levels with the way that you're working is so modern, but yet at the same time so traditional. You know, you're working in the way that people would have been working 1,000 years ago, and there's something so wonderful about how is this now modern again? But I wondered how you have refined over the last few years.
I guess I started out knowing that I didn't want to produce a lot. I didn't want to add to, I guess it just was easy if I gave you a bit of background. So in my gap year, I interned at Abercrombie and Fitch. Before I started Monad, I was designing for Urban Outfitters Europe and Asia. And again, we're talking about brands that are pumping volumes. And, again, it's just, I guess it's just how the business of fashion works, because everybody, has to make money at some point. So for the brands, they want the products to cost a certain amount. For the factory owner, he needs to make a certain amount of money because, he's got overheads to pay for as well. So when it comes down to it, it's just a case of the factory owner's like, yes, I could make it for this, but you would have to produce 1,000 pieces. And that's just the nature of the business. And I think being exposed to this kind of pushed me more in this sense that I didn't want to add to that. Like if I was going to do anything, it would have to be different from that. Because, even though like somewhere like Urban Outfitters, I guess is high street, it's the same, essentially it's the same system that, a lot of the designer brands do as well. Because I've been to factories that Urban Outfitters were using, but then a lot of these high-end brands use the same factories as well. So it made me question what the difference between the two really was to begin with. So for me, I always wanted to do something that was, there was a lot more value to it than just churning out like garments. Because I guess at the same time, I'm trying to remember what it was I read, but it was essentially saying that, the fashion industry was a big factor in like a lot of I guess environment, like the impact on the environment was huge. And that goes down right from growing the cotton, the pesticides used, etc. Slave labor as well in many countries. I mean, like even here as well. You'd be surprised. So yeah, there was a lot of things that I didn't really agree with at that time. So it kind of pushed me to what it is I'm doing now. So starting off, I knew that I wasn't going to be producing a lot because, when you're making garments by hand, it really limits how much you could produce at any one time. And given that the fashion industry works in seasons, because of course you wouldn't want to be wearing a wool jacket in the summer, essentially. So, you have to deliver in certain windows. So, yeah, I guess there isn't much that has changed. It's more a sense of trying to find ways to work within the system and still be profitable as a business, because at the end of the day, it is a business. I do enjoy what I do, and that's why I got into that. But I guess for me, the challenge has been trying to, I guess, trying to find a good balance between being a self-sustaining business, but still being able to deliver a really conscious product that I feel good about putting out in the world and not being a part of the problem.
Yeah. How do you approach the idea of seasons? Because that's an interesting thing. You're making clothes that are in every essence kind of timeless and things that ought to be cherished because they take a long time to make and they're very special. How do you work within the seasonal dictates?
Yeah, so I guess like that should have been my answer from the start. From very early on, I've been trying to get out of the whole season cycle.
Yeah.
But as any emerging designer will experience at some point, it's very difficult if you're just starting off and you're trying not to produce to the seasons, because obviously, again, it is a business. Buyers have a budget and a certain period of time they have to spend it in. And if you don't present your work to them within that space, you're less likely to get any sales than not. Because, that like if, say, for instance, London Fashion Week is in January and then Paris is in Feb. And so if you haven't shown them anything between that period, there are a lot of bigger brands out there that they would have seen and that budget potentially would have gone to. So if you then come to them in like April, it's already way too late. So I've had to be battling to kind of keep up with the seasons. And, it was like being in like the last 2 years before the pandemic was like reliving final year, but like every day, like no sleep, working all the time. But I've been able to kind of slow down now, and where I have stores that I've been working with for a few seasons now, they're kind of aware of the shapes I do, and if there's a new shape, then I can just show that to them, and then I send them fabric swatches, and then it stops me producing like samples every season that end up sitting on my rails. So yeah, in that aspect, it's been easier to manage the whole like constantly chasing, like just constant deadlines on deadlines on deadlines. I mean, I still have deadlines on deadlines and deadlines, but I'm less stressed with having to kind of, have a lookbook ready by the end of December, because then it has to be ready for the first week of Jan when London Fashion Week happens. So in that sense, it's been a lot easier for me to kind of manage that, and I'm kind of working more towards a system where the idea is to, when I have new shapes, present that to the buyers, so then they know that like all the shapes I work on they still exist every season. It's just a case of flipping the fabrication. So I guess a jacket you'd buy in the summer, like you'd probably want to use a linen, because it's a lighter fabric and more breathable. And then for winter, you can have the same silhouette. So then I'd have like a dead stock suit in wools and anything I kind of come across. In terms of Japan, I've noticed that they tend to buy kind of more transitional fabrication that could work across seasons. Because they're big into layering. So, like kind of midweight to heavyweight generally tends to work. So yeah.
Have you got any more pictures for us? They're beautiful.
Yes, I do. Sorry.
No, it's fine. That's why you're here. What's that jacket made out of?
So that's a suede.
It is suede.
Yeah, it's I guess it's the first time I'd ever worked with leather, which is again a whole different, it's a whole new world. But it's made from like skins that I guess deemed surplus. Essentially, I kind of got lucky again trolling through the basement of a leather shop, and I managed to find, I think it was like 5 or 6 skins that all kind of work together.
Wow.
So I had to alter the pattern to fit the skins that were available. So rather than buying a whole new skin, just kind of find what's there and work with it. You can't really see it from here, but the underarm like the undersleeve panel is kind of chopped up to kind of make it work, in terms of like cutting around the bits of the skin that was the reason it was a defect in the factory in the sense. But again, it's generally something I do because, again, a lot of the antique textiles I get, sometimes, you know, there'd be like water damage in it. But, you know, I don't mind so much because I'd end up dyeing it after. So I dye over the damage, or there's like holes in it, or, you know, again, buying from like warehouses where the fabric is deemed a defect. I guess you'd have like maybe one side of the fabric, there's like a line that doesn't really fit the rest. Again, I just kind of work around that because I'm not trying to produce 100 of the same garment. So it's just, I just find ways around it. And I guess that craftiness, I definitely say is part of my Nigerian African heritage.
Yeah. Let's keep looking. And if any of you have any questions, please do begin putting them in the chat.
Okay, like this is made from antique linen that I got friends to paint a mural on. So essentially, there's a jacket, shirt, and trousers, and you could actually put them all together, and it gives you the full painting.
Wow.
It was a bit of a nightmare for him, less so for me because all I had to do was make the garments. But the jacket, for instance, is kind of like a 360 of the painting. So I mean, I guess that was, I wouldn't even begin to think how you kind of make that happen.
Is this a screen print then, or is it a digital print onto? No,
it's painted on.
Okay, so there's only one of them?
Yeah, it is. Again, for me, like, I guess linen, you kind of use that as paint, canvas, oil painting. So it was just something that I thought was really interesting, and I guess something I could pull off because I might never have to produce it, or even if I did produce it, it'd be in a very small scale. This is a block print done by a couple based in Dorset, Bonfield block printers, and they work on a 19th century hand crank block print system. So it's really interesting. Cameron does all the art and kind of, you know, cuts into the wood to create the block print, which I think it's really amazing. But again, it's that whole kind of traditional way of working before the Industrial Revolution, and you know, everything has to be scaled up. But yeah, you get really interested in, I guess, print out with it. So, and I kind of like that, although the picture, everything looks even, but in reality, you know, it's all done individually. So there are some points where the print is like really heavy on, and there's others where it's, I mean, you just won't end up with the same thing every time. And I really like that aspect of working in like an old way. And I guess for me, like the pieces are more individual in a sense.
How do you relate to this idea of perfection? What does perfection look like to you?
I mean, again, it's a really difficult one. But because for me, I always struggled with finishing things. I still have the same problem now, but I'm still learning to kind of let things go and be like, it's fine as it is. So I guess the perfection comes from just doing something really well, but at the same time being free to, especially when you're working things by hand, you know, you can't replicate the same thing. Even when you're cutting out fabric individually, you're not going to cut the exact same things. There are times when, you know, the shares will move too far in. And for me, it used to be kind of a big thing just because I'm a bit of a control freak, and you know, I've had many arguments with my tailor about the seam allowance being like not quite right, but it'd be something like 2 millimeters, one that no one actually notices, but I do, and yeah. But yeah, I guess for me, it's more kind of being able to accept that, you know, if something's made right, like, then it's done. That is perfection, because like, you can't replicate perfection. It's like, if you're doing things over and over again, it's like, yeah, you're not going to do the exact same thing. So each one is perfect for what it is.
Yep. Yeah, because the reason I ask, because I think with a lot of the techniques we're using, you know, it's done by humans, and humans make mistakes, exactly. And there are sort of and the person that's engaging with what you're making understands that and almost is coming to you for that. You know, it's a bit like when you look at a bespoke suit, you can tell it's bespoke because the shoulder is actually not perfectly kind of crisp. You know, you can see the little fingers have gone in between to do the hand sewing. So there is that kind of ruffle, if you like, on a shoulder pad, which I always think is a wonderful kind of reminder of actually the hands that have made what it is that most of us are wearing, depending on where you shop. But I think there is this kind of interesting idea with what you're doing, that you can almost feel the hands all over the clothes, right? And the many hands that in lots of cases have kind of touched what it is that you're making. I think just want to wrap up with one last question in terms of how do you have a new collection at the moment? Do you have a new, what are you doing right now?
So right now I was gonna put out a new book, like I guess a lookbook for autumn winter, but again, like it's way too late for that. So I'm kind of more focused on, I guess, spring summer 22 now. And yeah, also I purposely didn't put out a collection last year, just because there was a lot of things happening and I just didn't feel like it was right. I feel like if I wasn't actively saying something about it, or my work wasn't really reflecting the reality of what was happening at the time, I just didn't feel there was any need for putting anything out at the time. And I guess similarly earlier on this year, but then, you know, again, it's just like, you know, if a tree falls in the woods and no one sees it, did it really fall? So I guess I was toying with whether or not to do an autumn winter collection. I mean, I'm working with the buyers, so they're just doing more bespoke collections. And again, it's just because they know the shapes and the silhouettes. I just send them fabric swatches, and it's like, okay, yeah, we'll take this. How many garments can we make in this, etc. So in that sense, I am producing things. I'm just not putting out. I just haven't put out a collection.
You just haven't told anyone.
Yeah, essentially.
You just haven't told us. Yeah. Been nothing on the Instagram.
Exactly. I mean, I'm useless on the Instagram anyway. It's a whole new world for me. I'm too busy making, not enough like showing the world what I'm actually doing. Like most of the time,
we've got lots of people here that will be able to help you with that. So if anyone does want to offer their services to help bring to life the amazing work that Daniel's doing, please do get in touch with him. Thanks so much for spending time with us this afternoon, Daniel. It's been really wonderful to hear you talk about your work. And I think what you're doing is, as I said earlier, a beautiful meeting of something that is incredibly traditional, but also feels completely right for the times. So I think that's a good place for us to wrap up. And again, thanks to everybody that joined us. We will try and make sure that this recording is available for more people to have a look at afterwards. So you can go back and look at some of those references that Daniel mentions. But enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate that.